Hello and welcome to OLA 2020. Thank you for joining us for Inquire and Explore to Boost Learning. I'm Ashley Dodderman, the OKSL Chair and Moderator for this session. I'm joined today by our presenters, Teresa Lansford, Martha Pangburn, Chloe Summers, and Catherine Lewis. I'll be back at the end of our session, but for now, I'd like to turn it over to our presenters.
Hello, my name is Teresa Lansford. I am the librarian at Lincoln Elementary in Norman.
Hi, I'm Martha Pangburn. I'm one of the teacher librarians at Norman High School.
I'm Chloe Summers. I'm another teacher librarian at Norman High.
I'm Catherine Lewis, and I'm the Director of School Libraries and Instructional Technology for Norman Public Schools. Welcome to our session. We're glad to have you here this morning. Our session is Inquire and Explore Boost Learning. At the bottom of your screen, you will see a website that has everything we're going to share with you today and much, much more. So we'll show that URL at the end of this presentation. 3 years ago, Norman Public Schools received a grant called Learning in Libraries, Guided Inquiry Making and Learning in School Libraries from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. The grant was for over $500,000, and it was to study the guided inquiry process and making in all levels, elementary, middle school, and high school. We have finalized our grant and published our results, and we're going to share a little bit about our work today. Our website that I mentioned earlier is about a replicable model of our work, so we want to share that with you. We want to share information about that and then where you can find that.
So as Catherine mentioned, in Norman, we use the guided inquiry design framework for our inquiry process. If you're not familiar with guided inquiry, it is research-based. It's based on Dr. Carol Kuhlthau's research on the information search process. And Dr. Kuhlthau, along with Leslie Maniotis and Ann Kaspari, have written numerous books on the guided inquiry design process. You'll see one of the books on the screen. This process is appropriate for students as young as pre-K and kindergarten all the way through high school. It is an instructional model that is meant to be used at the appropriate time. It is collaborative and involves co-teaching, and it is certainly enhanced by technology. So on the screen, you'll see the design framework, and there are 8 phases to this process. So I'm just going to briefly talk through those 8 phases before we move on. So the first phase is open. This is an invitation to inquiry where we are opening minds and stimulating our learners' curiosity. Immerse is the next phase. This is where we build background knowledge, make connections to the content, and help learners develop interesting ideas and discover interesting ideas. The third phase is explore. In this phase, learners explore interesting ideas, they look around and dip in. The next phase is identify. In this phase, learners are identifying their unique inquiry question. They're pausing and pondering and deciding the direction for their research. After identify, we move to gather. In this phase, learners are gathering important information. They're going broad and going deep. Gather is that traditional research phase that as librarians we are really familiar with. The next phase is create. In this phase, learners reflect on learning. They go beyond facts to make meaning, and they create to communicate. After the create phase is the share phase. In this phase, learners are sharing their learning, they're telling their story, and the students in the class are learning from each other. This is a really important phase in guided inquiry because learners are discovering information about all different ideas. And so they need to be able to share so that they can learn from each other. And then the final phase is evaluate, where we evaluate the achievement of learning goals. We reflect on the content and on the process. So you probably have noticed when you hear us go through those phases that typical research projects start in that gather phase. We tend to hand students topics and just send them into the research phase. So the first 4 phases of open, immerse, explore, and identify are really what make guided inquiry, I think, a unique process. So as we move through, we're going to begin by discussing foundational concepts. These are critical concepts for implementing inquiry and making. So the first critical concept is this learner-centered inquiry. So this really increases engagement because it allows learners to develop their own individual inquiry questions that they're interested in researching, allowing them to connect their personal interests to the curriculum. In guided inquiry, we call this the third space. It allows students to move at their own pace and revisit their previous work throughout this iterative process. And this really goes along with the AASL shared foundation of Inquire. And on the screen, you'll see a picture of a student. This is an 8th grade student in Norman in a physical science unit. And her inquiry question was, how does lacking sanitized water affect a society's development in regard to thriving? So this student, after completing her research, created a series of watercolors to demonstrate her learning. The interesting thing about this student is she was invited to present and share at a tech and learning committee meeting for the district. So a group of adults, and she got to sit down with a group and talk to them about her guided inquiry project and her making. And the interesting thing is that she told them that she chose to use watercolors as the medium because they're actually contaminated water. And we thought that connection was incredible, that this student would make that connection and also feel comfortable sharing that with adults. So that was kind of a cool thing. Another foundational concept is this idea of collaboration and co-teaching. So this aligns closely with that AASL shared foundation of collaborate. This involves shared planning, preparation, and reflection. Co-teaching involves that mutual responsibility for instruction and assessment, where all educators are actively contributing to the learning process and are accountable to all learners.
So another foundational concept is exploring and tinkering, which aligns closely with that AASL standard of explore. We found that it was really important to provide learners time to tinker and play with new maker tools before they begin a project. Familiarity with maker tools reduces the cognitive load and allows learners to focus on constructing new understandings. Educators should not assume that learners have experience with maker tools, so even things like Legos, where we think most kids will have used them, it's important to provide that opportunity at school to create that equity, because not all students will have access to those things outside of the school environment. Guided inquiry and learning by making share a lot of things in common. In particular, their process-oriented and student-centered approach from that constructivist point of view. However, making tends to differ from inquiry-based learning in the priority that it places on authorship. We found that with guided inquiry, it aligns with the curriculum and follows a predefined inquiry process. And when you couple that with making, it provides more autonomy to students who are encouraged to explore topics of their own interest and pursue projects that they choose, which leads to increased student interest, learning, self-regulation, and engagement at all levels, which leads us to our next foundational concept, learner voice and choice. So learner voice and choice aligns a lot with those choices that we were just talking about from exploring and tinkering. So voice is learners' personal experiences and perspectives, learning preferences, interests, and passions being encouraged and valued, and choice is when students have opinions regarding how they meet learning standards. So Whenever students come up with their own inquiry question, they choose their own topic. That's really letting them have their own voice. And then again, whenever they get to choose how they're going to demonstrate their learning in the making part of the process, they're able to choose how they're meeting those learning standards. So an example here would be the student from Lincoln. He's a 2nd grade student who his inquiry question was, how did Abraham Lincoln make the world different? And this kiddo was really interested in art, and so he used a graphic design software to create this image of Abraham Lincoln, which was then embroidered onto a fabric. So this is a really creative use of that, connecting those student interests to creating the demonstrated learning. Which then it goes into making. So making involves finding out about an issue or coming up with an idea, proposing solutions for the issue or creating plans for executing the idea, and then designing and testing the solution or project for a real audience or purpose. So we found that making takes time. Sometimes that can be a little tricky, allowing it to have the time that it really needs, but we found that that was really important. Making is really open. You're not telling kids you're going to make this. You're letting them make whatever they want to demonstrate their learning, going back to that voice and choice. It can be curriculum focused, which is what we're talking about here today when it's involved with inquiry. It can involve technology or not. So some of the examples we've seen so far have been pretty high tech, but we also saw that example of watercolor, which was not using technology really at all. It's very process oriented and can be iterative. So just like inquiry, you go back and forth. So students may make something and realize that it's not working, and so then they have to go back and try again or create something different. And it can involve failure. It's really important to address to kids that even if their project doesn't turn out to be successful, even after some iterations, showing that they have learned and what they have learned through the process can still be just as successful in terms of their grade and demonstrating their learning than having a completed successful project. So an example here that we have is from a 10th grade language arts world culture unit, where the student asked, in what way does the Muslim faith affect the everyday community? And so in order to demonstrate his learning, he created a 3D print of a mosque. And you can see that he has the 3D print there, but then also has the design in the back so that he can show how some of the details maybe don't come fully across in the design. So he can show you both of those examples. And making also aligns with that AASL standard of Explore. And then we move into the learning team. So inquiry and making cannot be done by just one person. It's not a job for just a classroom educator. So there are lots of different members of the learning team. So when you're talking about the different members, they can include your principal, your school librarian, your classroom educator, and more. So this also goes really well with that AASL standard of collaborate, because we're all collaborating to create the successful experience for students. So if we're talking about the different roles within these learning team members, librarians really set the tone for inquiry and making by establishing clear expectations for participation and supporting success. They can provide professional development resources and training for educators. Collaboration time with the school librarian ensures that the structures needed for successful inquiry and making, such as growth mindset and learners' voice and choice, are valued within the school's culture. The librarian can also offer valuable insight into which educators can approach an inquiry and making team, so which educators to include. The school librarian also plays a critical role in the design and implementation of inquiry and making units. They can create resources and conduct research interviews, act as a coach and a guide, and they are essential co-teachers in the process as learners explore content, ask questions, develop their own inquiry question, gather resources, and create artifacts. Now, the classroom educator acts as the learner's guide throughout the inquiry making process. They bring in specific content knowledge and expertise to the unit design. So where the school librarian brings in that research, inquiry, and making knowledge, the classroom educator brings in their content and curriculum knowledge. They also bring in a great knowledge of classroom dynamics, strategies, and responses to implementing the framework. So nobody knows the classroom relationships and dynamics better than the classroom educator, and so that knowledge is really important when you're creating the lessons within the unit. Some other educators that you can bring into the learning team are your counselors, your special education teachers, your gifted and talented educators, your EL teachers, your administrators. You can bring in district personnel, you can bring in your instructional technology coaches, and you can even bring in community members to provide different insights for your project.
So now we get into the unit design piece and the things we learned that were essential to setting students and teachers up for success throughout the unit. The first of these things is a little bit different if you're considering a traditional model, and that's that instead of looking at topics that we need to cover, we thought about concepts. So when you think about topics, you think of a list of who, what, when, where, and why. In this example, we have a student who is asking a question, Revolutionary War. So you think in a traditional model that we would have students remembering, or finding out facts about different events in history or people that were part of that. Instead, what we do is we think about the overarching concept. Why do we want kids to know about these people, these times, these events? And so for our team in 5th grade, they realized they wanted students to think about the concept of unification. What brings people together around a cause? And so when you think about concept-based learning, then students have a lot more opportunity to develop their own questions, to bring their own curiosity and interest into the standards. And so we look at a student like this boy who asked, how did the different fighting styles contribute to who won the Revolutionary War? He ended up creating a Bloxels video game in which he had a character that was a soldier going along meeting different revolutionary soldiers, different British soldiers, and finding out about their styles of combat as he went through this game. An important thing for this student was that he was ready to give up early on, because when he tried to Google fighting styles for the Revolutionary War for the British, for instance, he had a lot of trouble. He thought there was no information on it. And so we got to have a nice coaching session where we generated different keywords. And when he decided to change his keyword from fighting styles to, say, battle strategies, he found this wealth of information opened up to him. It was a great, authentic lesson for him to realize that it's not just one way to access that information. You have to actually have some skill with finding information. I think his assumption was, if I type these words, everything I need to know will come to me. He had a lot of faith in a search engine. And so when we look at this concept-based learning, it's critical for success. It's still standards-based. He's going to learn a lot of the standards and concepts and bring that information back to the entire community of his class, so that all of these students with their different questions will end up covering that content, just in a different way than that traditional model, much more connected to personal interests. So when we look more at that learner questioning, in our inquiry model, each student is developing their own question from that concept umbrella. And so they're connecting their personal interests to the content. As Chloe mentioned earlier, we call that I think it was Chloe, might have been Martha, sorry. We call that third space. And so we have a 1st grade example here of a student who, when we were looking at the concept of animal survival with 1st graders, how are animals well suited to their environment? She asked, why do animals have whiskers? And she compared a lot of land and water animals to see why the whiskers can help them with survival. She found out a lot about how animals get through certain spaces, or in water, maybe they sense the currents to know if things nearby are a predator or prey. And then she went into our makerspace and used model magic to create these figures along with some props in order for her to teach her peers about what she learned. And I know Martha has an example from the high school.
Yeah, so on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see an example from our 9th grade physical science unit around the concept of waves. And this student's question was, how can sound wave vibrations benefit deaf people in the performing arts? And she was really interested in the performing arts and in dance in particular. And so she created this cool project. So it's a little bit hard to see in the picture, but it's a box. And inside the box are some beads and also some 3D printed figures. And then she put the box on top of a Bluetooth speaker. And so for her presentation, she played music through the speaker and demonstrated how those sound waves created the vibrations in that floor of the box. And so the people and the beads began to dance and to move and to jump around. And you can see she had some other information. She had her question across the top. I think she maybe even had a QR code that led to more information. But it was something that she was genuinely interested in, and such a creative use of some low tech, some high tech, all mixed together to create a project that really demonstrated her learning in a unique and creative way.
And I think you can see how these sorts of projects integrate so many, just numerous AASL standard areas in one session, in one sharing of these students. You can just start marking off through your standards. All of these things we've been able to cover with students. But how do we get them to these great questions? Well, we need to encourage questioning every day. And so kids don't just walk up and say, oh, I have my question. It's completely formed and it's perfect. It's definitely a deliberate process of coaching students and giving them structures so that they can get to a question that is deep, that is contributing to their learning community, that's new information that they've synthesized for themselves. And so we have places in the elementary school, for example, a variety of places where students can record questions. It could be chart paper, that's I wonder, and teachers are writing along with students. It could be sticky notes. I have in my middle grades of elementary, a lot of places where they can browse through books and start putting their sticky notes of questions they come up with throughout, so that other students, as they're browsing, can then start to see what other people are thinking and wondering about. It can be an inquiry log where they're recording their questions. And then we start modeling good questioning techniques. What is a question that will help us to dig deep, that will help us to have to synthesize some information and really create some new knowledge and new understandings from that? And there's a variety of frameworks that teachers can use with students to help them model. We do things like word banks. We give kids time to share out questions and think about how they could tweak them to maybe be a little deeper. The important thing, though, is to honor the heart of that question with a student. So we know kids have a genuine interest. And so even if their question isn't quite there yet, then we coach them and we keep them on that same track of what they were genuinely interested in. Because I've even had fifth graders who kind of tried to collapse a little and say, well, my question wasn't perfect, so I'm just going to switch my whole area of inquiry. No, we don't need to do that. We just need to think, okay, you, for instance, have a genuine interest in Benedict Arnold. But instead of just asking very surface area things about him, how can we make comparisons between him and his peers? Or how could we find out what impact he made? And so you keep honoring that curiosity, that heart of the question, and just help kids get there to where they're really going to do some deep learning. Another way you can facilitate this is through inquiry circles. So it's not just on that team of teachers to always be coaching and modeling for kids, especially when you think of when this process gets really ingrained with students. In Norman Public Schools, in my elementary school, for example, these students will start doing inquiry units in pre-K and will do about 2 a year for their entire career. And so when they get to fifth grade, there are times when we just tell them what phase we're beginning on and they know the routines and get right to work. I remember I went in to co-teach with a teacher once. We started floor where students were going to be looking through different materials, evaluating them, deciding if they were helpful to them as a learner, and recording questions that they had. And I thought I was ready to dig in and co-teach. We said, okay, guys, today we're starting Explore, and we have some materials for you in your Google Classroom. And then they didn't need us. And I looked at the teacher, and I was like, well, they're fifth graders. They've done this a really long time. And so she had some questions about how to better put things on a Google Classroom. So I actually used some of our session to coach her a little and then did my check-ins with students. And so these students really start to internalize and can support one another. They can listen to each other's questions and provide feedback. I've had second graders doing that, listening to one another's questions and saying, if you changed it to why, and they'll give that sort of feedback. But it's not just for the questioning phase. These inquiry circles are multi-purpose and align really well with the AASL standard of collaborate standards, getting kids to work together because they can start sharing information. When we group inquiry circles by interest area, for example, there'll be students who come across resources that say, well, this doesn't work for my question, but I remembered it worked for her question. I'm going to email it to you. And so they'll email one another resources. It builds this community of inquiry where people are really striving to help one another answer their questions. They see that value and they support one another. And so inquiry circles can be used throughout in a variety of ways to really help peers support one another.
Another important aspect of the unit design is conferencing. So conferencing allows for the librarian and classroom educator to really provide that individual support. It creates designated check-in times throughout the process. We mentioned earlier that the process is iterative, and sometimes students go back to look at previous work. So not all learners are going to be at exactly the same point at exactly the same time. And so conferencing kind of creates those designated check-in times so that we can ensure that learners are on track and that we're providing them with the support that they need. It also, it can be done, it's typically done one-on-one. We typically use our entire extended team during conferencing. At high school, we often have, classes of 36 students. And so we'll use the classroom teacher. We have 2 librarians. We'll use our instructional coach, anyone else that we can pull in, sometimes a special education teacher, to participate in those conferences. It's important when we're conferencing with students that we're open to what the student has to say and that we don't ask leading questions. We want to ensure that the students are taking ownership over their learning, and we want to not get in the way of that. Sometimes it's helpful as teachers to have questions to guide the conferences so that we kind of know where we're headed, where we want them to end up, but not leading them too strongly in that way. Conferencing is really one of my favorite parts of guided inquiry of the process. We conference with learners during the questioning phase to really help them get to that high level question. We also use it during the research phase. Through this research, this grant, we discovered that many students identified the gather phase as the most challenging part of the research process, was the actual research, which is probably not surprising to most of us as librarians. And so we began implementing conferencing during that gather phase as well. And then also during the making phase, conferencing can be really critical to help guide students through that making process and help them not be too, get too frustrated with making and just encourage them. So in the research part of the unit design, this is a great opportunity for the librarian to push in for mini lessons. These mini lessons can include search terms, database skills, citations, paraphrasing, evaluating sources, confirmation bias, all of those skills and those concepts that we want to instill in our students. Those fit into that research phase. We also use research logs, inquiry logs during the research phase so that learners are able to keep track of their citations, website URLs. They're able to take notes, reflect on the sources, evaluate sources. And this really goes along with the AASL standards of curate and engage. On the screen, the image that you see, this is at Longfellow Middle School in Norman, and these students are studying habitats and they're working in inquiry circles. And you can see each inquiry circle has a big screen that they're able to view content. These students were grouped, I believe, by their questions and their concepts. And so they were able to view material together and have discussions and work through that research process.
So one thing that we found was really important throughout this process was having students answer their inquiry question before making. We found that when we didn't do this, students tended to get really distracted by the making and not finish their research or not connect their research to what they actually created. So having them answer that question led to more complete research and in turn better products and understanding. So these answers can look a couple of different ways. They could be handwritten, they could be typed. A lot of times at Norman High, we like to use a Google form. They could be just a verbal check-in. They could be recorded and put on something like Flipgrid. They could be in a lot of different formats as well. So like a paragraph, a whole essay. We've had teachers put essays in their units, just a little blurb or bullet points. So I guess the point is just that they can be various lengths and complexities depending on what your goal is there, but just make sure that there's something to have them answer that inquiry question before you move on to making. This can also be a great way to ensure that you're meeting writing and reading standards while doing inquiry and making. So like, again, if you have those little written components. The example of our student project that is here is from, again, that world culture unit. And this was a student whose question was about Confucianism. They said, how has Confucianism influenced China's core values and practices? And they learned that Confucianism was really focused on community. And so they decided to create a sculpture where people are kind of in a circle and holding each other up. Now you might see that her product is made out of sheet metal. Now at Norman High, we don't have sheet metal or ways for them to cut sheet metal. And so she did her project outside of school. She had a family friend who had an air conditioning company and they had access to these tools and they were able to help her cut out the sheet metal to create her sculpture. So this is a good example of how sometimes the projects were worked on outside of school and not only within the school building. Which sort of takes us to our next point, which is making. So we think about making sort of along the lines of design thinking. So empathizing, designing, ideating, prototyping, and testing. We found that it was really important to have these 3 steps within making. So planning can look at a bunch of different ways. Again, at Norman High, we like to do a Google form, a project planning form, but again, it could be a verbal check-in, something else, a paper where they write or draw on. So we found that planning really needed to include what materials they needed. That was important for us to know what we needed to provide them access to or what they needed to get access to outside of school, what other resources they need. A time management plan is really helpful, especially with teenagers. They're not the greatest at time management on their own, so having them think about that is really useful. And then either a design diagram or a description of what exactly they're going to create and how it relates back to their research project. And then prototyping. So we like to check in with students, you know, a little way through. So it's the first draft. So reflect and share your progress. So how does it connect to your research question? Again, we're emphasizing that because it's really important to reiterate that that's important. What have your challenges been so far? What do you need to accomplish in the next X amount of time? And then we'll have them either show us a picture of the project, show us their project, or attach a link. Again, we normally use Google Forms, or this is also a good place to do conferencing or a combination of both. So, and then iterating. So the student creates their project. Does it work? Yes, no. Do they need to try again? Those kinds of things. Again, aligning with that AASL standard of Explore. And then here's another example of a student project. This one is from an Algebra 2 social justice unit over statistics. And her question is, what is the number of deaths by capital punishment per year in the United States, and how has the death penalty changed in the US over time? So this student decided to create an electric chair as her project, and she did woodworking. The student didn't have any experience with woodworking, but one of her friends, another student in the class, did. And that student was actually creating a project that had to be worked on at home. So that student helped this student learn how to woodwork during the class time. So this is a great example of how sometimes those kiddos who are working on stuff at home can still be involved during the class time. So they worked together to create this project, and she ended up creating the electric chair, which is a really cool representation of her question. But she also created a PowerPoint that explained the research behind her answer to her question. So another thing that we found with our kids is if they made something more abstract, sometimes it's important to have another element that really explains the research and connects it back. So whether that's a PowerPoint, a little plaque, a poster, whatever to go along with it.
And I think that's true across all grade levels. We'd have our young students with things that as a teacher you'd look at and go, I don't understand, and then they'd start talking and it would be brilliant. So one example of that was we had students looking at symbolism and how our civil rights leaders remembered. And so we had students who were creating their own symbols to remember civil rights leaders. And we had this boy who tended to be a quick finisher just as part of his regular life. And so he had asked about the impact that Martin Luther King Jr. had, and he created a sculpture in Model Magic. And he didn't paint it, he had just some figures together, and his teacher was trying to get him to do a little bit more work, you know, and so she went to talk to him and she said, aren't you going to paint it? Or she was trying to come up with ideas for him, and he said no, because Martin Luther King Jr. saw everyone the same, and so I want everyone to look the same. And then she was just kind of blown away by his brilliance and his insight, you know, and so it's good to have those conversations with kids and have them, no matter what the grade level, some way of recording their thought behind what they're making. Now, once you have a kid do something that great, right? They've made an electric chair, okay? It feels like a finish line. But it's so important in this process that you make sure to take time to do that last phase of evaluation, evaluate the work they've done, the process, and not just as a teacher, but letting kids self-evaluate on this process. That's another way that they can internalize the work they've been doing. It can come in a variety of formats. There's things like Padlet, Seesaw, Flipgrid, you know, we have those different digital tools. And then there's just things like exit tickets, where kids are able to give feedback to one another and, you know, reflect on what they've seen. You want to make sure as an educator that you did cover your standards. And so this is one way to make sure students are gaining understandings from one another's work. And then, of course, self-reflection is a different format for students. We have two examples here, depending upon the age level. And so we have kids reflect how they felt about the process, how they felt about their answers. Kids sometimes may be frustrated if their product doesn't look as perfect as they thought it was in their mind. And that's why process is so important. And we always ask our students, what questions do you still have? Because we want to make sure that this inquiry process just doesn't end because you have this product. Now that you've had feedback from your friends, maybe there's things you realize you need to ask about more, or things you want to change. So when we think about that student, we looked at her product earlier where she asked about animals with whiskers. When she was presenting her product, had a fellow student say to her, well, what about daddy whiskers? And she had to say, you know, I don't know why daddies have whiskers and how they keep them safe or help them find, you know, prey or whatever. She had no idea, but it gave her a new area to think about. And kids are, throughout this process, really comfortable with that fact that they're going to get questions that they may say, I don't know, you know, and that's a great thing. We're celebrating that. We have more questions to ask now. And so as teachers, when we evaluate their work, we want to make sure that we don't focus just on the product, that we focus on the process that students went through as well. We want to make sure that they have covered their standards, that they understand the content, but we also want to look at their products and look at some of those AASL standards for that, you know, collaborating and being able to be innovative and ask questions those as they went along throughout the process. How well did they do exemplifying those standards as well? And so that can take on a variety of forms for teachers and for librarians, but it's important that we have that and that our focus is kind of broad in how we're looking at this with students so that we make sure we cover multiple facets of this process.
It's also really important for us as educators to reflect on the unit itself. So every time that we've done a unit, it never looks the same the next time. We're always changing and making things better for students as we go along. So some questions that you can consider are, what worked well? What did not work well? Did the learners achieve the standards? What did they struggle with the most? And where were they the most successful? And of course, how can the unit be improved in the future? A lot of these questions could also be used for student reflection as well. So again, what worked well, what did not work well? Those are pretty obvious, but did you achieve the standards? Where did you struggle and where did you succeed the most? You could also ask questions about how they felt they were supported by the learning team.
So you think about the implications for school culture here. And of course, the impact on the school community is very broad. There's learner empowerment, certainly increased engagement with students that we saw, Our learners seem to be able to develop their growth mindset as well as us as educators developed our growth mindset. Certainly cultivated voice and choice, which we talked about earlier in our students. We keep seeing that. It really stretches our learners as they think about their questions, as they iterate, and as they work on their making, and as they reflect on their projects and reflect on their learning and reflect on the learning of their peers. Really builds a culture of inquiry and exploration throughout the school community. And one of the things that we see is it allows our learners to succeed and really take ownership in their work. One of our students said that this project was, they worked the hardest on this project that they'd worked on any other project ever. So also for school libraries and for school librarians, again, it brings you to the center of the school community and brings your library, your school library, to the center of the school community. It helps your school library and to be thought of as really that hub of innovation and exploration and creativity in the building, as well as the hub of research and learning. It helps your fellow classroom educators think of the school librarian as a teacher, a coach, a collaborator, and certainly as an instructional leader in the building. It provides opportunities for exploration and self-directed learning. I'm going to share with you a little bit about the young man on the right. This is a 10th grade English class. Again, the topic is around social justice. And when I came into this room to watch him share his project, he had both of his feet on top of the table here. And he had on this white shoe you see on one foot, and the black shoe you see in his hand on the other foot. And I had observed this classroom many times and had watched this student several times working. And so when I got to him, I said, "Tell me about your question and then tell me about your shoes." And he said, "Well, my question was, how is civil rights different from civil rights now, different from civil rights back in the day?" And those were actually the words he used. And I said, "So what have you found out?" And he said, "Well, I found out lots of things, and that's why I have these shoes." And he said, "I have one shoe that's about leaders from back in the day. So Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks. I had a whole series of important civil rights activists. And on the other shoe, he said, I have sports figures who are interested in civil rights." So he had listed those, made hashtags for them all over his shoes, and had put quotes from them on the shoes. And I said, "So why the shoes?" And he said, "Well, I wanted people to ask me about my shoes." And I said, "Well, have they?" And he said, "Yes. People have stopped me in the hall and asked me why I have on one white shoe and one black shoe and why they have writing all over them." And I said, "Well, how did you learn your information about to study? Where did you do your research?" And he said, "Well, I listened to podcasts that my school librarian helped me find." So I thought that was really interesting for a 10th grade student. He was truly engaged in this process. And later we found out that he had posted pictures of his shoes on Snapchat. So we certainly saw that engagement, that level of engagement in this student. So what's next for us? Our grant is over. We moved forward this spring with makerspace. We have makerspaces in all our school libraries where learners can create, build, and innovate, and to pursue their own interest or to demonstrate a standards-based learning outcome like we've talked about here. I think that one of the things that we're trying to do is we have brought this to all our schools now, and all our schools did a making and guided inquiry unit this school year. And that's been interesting to see. And of course, we will move forward with that as we move on. I would like for Teresa to take a second and share the work of this young man, where the question is in the picture or here on the slide. Teresa, do you mind?
Yeah, so this was a second grader, once again looking at symbolism and civil rights. And his question was, how did Chief Joseph's actions change Native American rights? And he wanted to share his information through GarageBand, making some music. Like we mentioned earlier, of course, he needed to have kind of a written piece or a speech along with it so he could explain his music. But he went home and talked to his mom about his project, and they talked about different instruments together. And that's another thing that we saw with these units, that kids were going home and talking to their parents. They were, over the summer, having conversations still about what they'd learned with these units. And when you think about how often do kids really do that with traditional curriculum, I think it once again speaks to the power of this. And so he came back, he wanted to make some music with flutes. And it was very important for him to make the music sad, because Chief Joseph did not get what he wanted for his people. And so he shared that. His piece was lovely, and it was really impressive for a second grader. Once again, though, going back to that process, we had another student who worked to make some music as well, and his music was something that you just kind of smiled at. But he had an important message too, because he wanted to use GarageBand to teach others about what Jackie Robinson did for the baseball movement. And so he had just one sound, and then he started adding more sounds and more sounds and more sounds, and it sounded about like you could imagine. But his message behind it was that Jackie Robinson made baseball so much more interesting because of all the different people who could then play and be part of the sport. And so once again, it's all thinking about why kids are making the choices they are, and they have some really profound reasonings behind that.
I wanted to share this website with you. Again, there is lots and lots of information. There are lesson examples, there are videos, there is narrative, there are other resources, there are books and articles and other kinds of things that you can link to. So I hope you will use this website. It is our replicable model of what we've learned on our grant. So again, we want to thank the Institute of Museum and Library Services for making this possible for us, and we hope that you've enjoyed today. So I think now it's time for questions and answers. So Ashley, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Well, in light of everything that we have going on right now in the world with COVID-19, and education is ever changing, whether it's distance teaching or we're in person, how do you guys, how will you continue this work of Inquire and Explore and guided inquiry with your students as we move forward?
I think one thing that will help us implement this, no matter what school looks like, is that we at my school have already implemented a lot of technology into the process. So we use HyperDocs for our inquiry journals and inquiry logs. And so that's just a linked Google Doc if you're not familiar with HyperDocs. So we create a template, and it has essentially a table of contents on the first page of the document that students are able to then just click to go directly to a specific section. And then that HyperDoc is usually given to students through Google Classroom. And so the classroom teacher will make the librarian a co-teacher on the Google Classroom. And so we're able to see what the students are working on in real time. And so I see that as being a huge benefit if we are doing guided inquiry during some kind of break from school, distance learning. I think the use of the HyperDoc and Google Classroom will really be a benefit to us. And I know we have some ideas for making, I don't know if you were going to talk about that, Teresa, about how we could send home, you know, bags of supplies and things that students could use for making at home. We're kind of exploring what some of those ideas might look like. Teresa, I'll let you
And at
talk.
the elementary level, we used Seesaw pretty successfully to let students still continue exploring resources and recording questions and their ideas. I was able to do a Google Meet with a first grade class where we talked about different types of questions, and so they still had some of those opportunities. And we even had some students who just took things from home and they would put them together to show what they've been learning throughout, and that was first grade. One thing that we did pretty deliberately while we were on the break too was to have maker challenges that were easily accessible to students to look around at anything they might have in their home and be able to create something. And I think that giving kids that mindset too, that it doesn't have to be our Magnetiles or our Legos or our Model Magic, that you might have some things around your house that you can create some pretty cool things with, was important. We didn't want to make it a matter of, you know, kids or parents feeling like they had to run out and buy cotton balls or, you know, craft sticks or something like that. What do you have in your home? And so, like Chloe mentioned earlier, that it was so important to let kids tinker and play. I think part of this process is letting kids kind of explore their surroundings and say, what do I have around me that I could use to make and share my learning?
Sort of piggybacking off of what both of them said, the use of technology at the high school, having already been really highly effective, will help us a lot as we move forward. Like our library website, our students are really familiar with how to use it. We have lots of tutorials there for how to access our databases, how to use different maker tools, and they know that that's a place where they can go to find that information and also find out how to do things, or to get in touch with us if that information isn't already on there. So having already sort of established that, I think will really help moving forward.
Awesome. I think those are wonderful ideas that we can definitely put into use if we have to continue distance learning. Thank you, ladies.
I wanted to share our information, how to contact us if you have questions. Again, please use our replicable website, but here is all of our emails. So thank you all. Happy making and inquiry.
Okay, and then going to thank you, ladies. That was awesome. And I know I took away some new ideas that I'm excited to put into practice into my library. So I know others out there will be excited to put that into practice as well. Thank you for presenting at OLA 2020, and thank you to everyone who joined us for this session. If you were encouraged and inspired by this session, we hope you would consider joining OKSL. Please go to your conference app and fill out a session evaluation for our session, and then we hope you'll join us for others. Thank you.